Hello and welcome. My name is Anamaya Lee. I'm a graduate student with the University of Southern California and an ISC intern with the SISG Group. I welcome you to my Grief 5 Best Practice video series. Today is my second interview in this Grief 5 series, where we will highlight best practices for educators and key players in the lives of children and teenagers impacted by the grief experience of parental deployment. With me, I have Benjamin Wilson. He's the Focus Site Director for the Naval Base, Ventura County, since 2009. Excuse me. He's a certified focus trainer and California licensed marriage and family therapist with prior experience in counseling and clinical rehabilitation for at-risk youth in residential and outpatient settings. Additionally, Mr. Wilson has several years' experience as a behavioral therapist, serving children and families dealing with developmental and behavioral challenges. He also has an expertise facilitating parent coaching and psychoeducational groups. Mr. Wilson received his master's degree from Fuller Seminary School of Psychology. So Benjamin, I thank you so much for joining me today. The first question I have for you is, what are the 5 best practices for working with children and teens impacted by parental deployment?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I tried to boil it down to 5, and I think I kind of boiled over a little bit. I think a great place to start is prevention. I think it's really important for whether we're talking with families or we're talking providers, teachers, etc., to get people really thinking preventively about the different kinds of transitions that are coming up. And we deal here quite a bit with deployments at various stages. And we find that when families are under distress, or they're getting ready for the transitions within the next 2 weeks, etc., they come in to utilize our program. A lot of times they're already in crisis mode, or they're really rushed. They're feeling rushed to kind of expedite the process. Let's get the skills dialed in and everything else. We find that it's much more helpful if families are able to come in well ahead of the transitions, which is a nice thing about deployment transitions, is that they don't usually come as a surprise. Now, that there are exceptions to that, of course. Depending on the branch of service, depending on the job of the service member, and things like that. But we find that if you can get some just basic skills really effectively dialed in months ahead of time, it really gives you a good fighting chance when those transitions come up. It also helps you to get your head around the kind of communication that you need to have, especially with children during deployments. We have a lot of folks who will come in within a month of a departure and haven't talked to their kids about it yet, which is fine. But a lot of times they'll ask questions about what should we tell them? What should we not tell them? I find that a lot of those kinds of specific questions are not as crucial if you have a preventive mindset where you're addressing some of these things well ahead of time, and the lines of communication are really effectively open. So thinking preventively is really important for everyone involved. Also, another aspect is respecting the owners of this process. I think that it's really important for providers and for parents to not define the experience for the kids, or for teachers to define the experience to the parents. I find that it's really helpful to be more curious instead. So we all have interpretations that we bring to the table, and I think it's really important to address those interpretations in the form of questions. And I think that's a skill set that people really need to learn. It's not something that necessarily comes naturally. So when we're talking about preparing for a deployment as a grief process, we want to not be so kind of adamant about how we're defining that process as a grief process. It's fine for us to be able to address it that way with our own methodologies and everything, but ask a lot of questions and be open to how the child defines the experience. Be open to how the parent defines the experience. I think that's really good feedback for teachers and for practitioners, especially who don't have a lot of military experience. Also, I think, as I mentioned before, if you have really good prevention and lines of communication are open, it really can make for a much more positive transitional experience. And when we're talking about deployment transitions, we're talking about a staged transition, really, that you can anticipate. Usually, several months ahead of time, and there are exceptions, like in the SEAL community and things like that, where people do have kind of last minute deployments. But by and large, people are able to make plans around these things months ahead of time, and making sure that the communication is open during that time in terms of helping kids feel comfortable, asking lots of questions, having kids feel comfortable, sharing their emotional leveling, which is a skill that we work on with Focus, kind of as a foundation. To keep the lines of communication open, we simplify the communication. We actually narrow it down to a color system, and we help kids to kind of identify how intensely uncomfortable or comfortable they're actually feeling. And when families regularly practice those things well ahead of time, it really kind of greases the wheels of that communication, so that every conversation that you have, or say the first conversation that you have, doesn't feel so crucial. It doesn't feel like a deal breaker, because it's a start of a conversation. It's not the only conversation that you're going to have. And I think that is really freeing for a lot of parents who come in and work with us, is they feel like there's this one conversation that we're going to have about the deployment, and there's so much riding on it. And that can really create a lot of anxiety. So when we teach people to effectively and very simply actually grease the wheels of those communication by teaching just a few basic skills and a few basic emotional regulation tools, those conversations become a little less crucial. They become a little less, there's a little less stress around them, which really frees up the family quite a bit to effectively use the other skills and practice them. So maintaining safe, open communication is extremely important. And we use a lot of the kind of standard communication skills that many people use with families also, like active communication, I statements, and things like that can be really helpful. Something specific for military families is also being aware of transitional reminders. So not every student that you have every military student you have in a classroom is going to be responding to deployment the same way. If you have multiple kids in the same classroom who are dealing with deployments or who are dealing with military service, each of those kids' experiences aren't necessarily generalizable, and kids aren't always aware of that. So what I mean by this, let me give you an example. So we have several elementary schools that are serving the base that we serve here at Focus. And we have several different commands, CB commands here, who CBs are construction battalions, and a lot of those battalions go on what we call green deployments, which are non-combat humanitarian aid deployments, and they'll go and build structures on bases and schoolhouses in Cambodia, and all kinds of different things like that. So we'll have a child from one command who has a parent who is in Japan and Okinawa at our base hub. And we'll have another child whose parent is in the same command who's in, say, Guam or something like that. Now, they're from the same command. Their parents are deployed at the exact same time, but their missions are very different. And when those kids talk about their deployment, they're not necessarily aware that they're talking about their parents being in completely different places, doing completely different jobs and everything else. So this is another kind of calling back to the importance of open communication, regularly asking questions. There are these kinds of reminders that come up in daily life, whether we see something on the news or our kids encounter a story of another child at school, that we need to kind of help people effectively navigate. We need to help the kids effectively navigate it. We need to normalize it for the parents. And that's something that not a lot of people are necessarily very well aware of, is the way that kind of these reminders can kind of creep in. And if communication is not as open, they won't necessarily be aware that anything has changed. They won't necessarily be aware of why certain behavior changes are happening, and things like that. And really, when we're looking at a deployment departure or a reunion, we have kind of an anticipated kind of buffer zone of about a month, either side of a departure, either side of a reunion, where we really expect a lot of different behavior changes to happen. We'll see kids have increases in externalized behaviors if that's their tendency. So we'll see a lot more things like tantrum behaviors, yelling, screaming, protesting, and things like that. Or if they have a bent more toward what we call internalized behaviors, which are more withdrawal kinds of behaviors, we'll see an increase in those things within a month, potentially, either side of that punctuated transition of the departure or the reunion. Those things are really normal and have a lot of those kind of transitional reminders associated with them. And it's really important that parents are able to navigate a lot and anticipate the anxiety that comes along with some of those transitional reminders, and just kind of helps kind of, again, grease the wheels of the communication, make everything kind of open. And that's a big kind of safety factor. Also, emotional regulation challenges and changes. It's really important that we help parents kind of anticipate those kinds of things by giving them that feedback ahead of time. These are the things that we regularly see. A lot of times parents will come to our program. We're a family training program, so we don't specifically work individually with children, but we have a lot of parents who will come in and say within that kind of month either side of the deployment departure, and they'll say, I need you to work on my kid. And we'll very graciously kind of educate them about some of the expected transitions and normalize some of those things, just so that the parents are a little more at ease, but also point out that just because something is normal doesn't mean that's what you want. And we want to develop just a few core skills that families can use really effectively to smooth out that transition, so that everybody feels safe and trusting and able to kind of advocate for what they want, what they need in that situation, which the younger the kids are, the less they know about what they really need. And so it's even more important for parents to be able to have open communication with their kids and teach their kids how to effectively communicate their feelings, so that parents are more equipped to help them deal with them effectively. We also want to help children identify points of strength and pride and gratitude about their experiences. We know that military families and military children specifically have a lot of tremendous strengths, really strong social skills, adaptive abilities, and things like that we really want to emphasize, so that this doesn't feel a completely catastrophized kind of situation when they're getting ready for this deployment departure. So by identifying the strengths, points of pride, gratitude, and things like that, we're really able to help them identify what they're working with, what their assets are that they're bringing to bear on this transition. So keeping it positive can be really helpful. And one skill that we really strongly recommend to a lot of families who are at the beginning end of a deployment is various forms of journaling. Now, that can involve just kind of the standard usual journaling, where we're kind of writing out our feelings and this is what happened during the day and things like that. But also there are really neat ways that we can help families collectively journal. One method that we use here is called trade journaling, where we encourage families to keep a journal that they write encouragement to each other in, and they'll pass it along to each other, and sometimes they'll even send it overseas and kind of trade it back and forth that way. It's a way of kind of writing encouraging letters to each other, but you're keeping it in the same place. And we've had a lot of really creative families who have given us feedback on some really neat ways of doing that, kind of surprising the child with the journal on the nightstand every once in a while with a new kind of encouraging message. Or a parent, in anticipation of the deployment, if a service member wants to do this, they can write out a bunch of encouraging messages to the child to be given to the child at various dates and things like that, which makes for a really great transitional object. So there are a whole bunch of different ways to kind of help kids maximize those points of strength and help the family kind of rally around those strengths to be able to kind of maximize their assets, so to speak.
Wow. Thank you very much. So can you highlight some similarities and differences you see between the 5 grief experiences of death, divorce, deployment, incarceration, and foster care placement as they pertain to children and teens?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the similarities that I can definitely see are behavior change. With all of these different kinds of transitions, you can anticipate, regardless of where the child is developmentally, that there are definitely going to be some internal changes, and in response to the external changes. There are definitely a lot of emotional regulation challenges as well, whether we're talking about the externalized set, the internalized set, or a combination of the two. There's definitely a need for improved emotional regulation skills. And there are also amplified communication challenges in that. A lot of times when we're encountering a significant amount of emotional distress, some of the communication skills kind of go out the window. And we always say, I especially say this with military couples, but we always say that a communication challenge is first and foremost an emotional regulation challenge. And we need to be getting ourselves back to what we call the green, or that kind of calm state, so that we can effectively communicate. And I think that that is a true factor for all five areas of that we're talking about. As far as differences go, especially for sort of these kind of punctuated grief experiences, like deployments, prolonged incarceration, any kind of prolonged separation, there is a sense that there is going to be ongoing contact with the individual. Potentially, what that looks like is going to be different for each individual. But there's a difference between some of these areas in the sense of permanence that a child may have, or that a parent may communicate about the situation. When it comes to deployments, we usually have a pretty good idea of how long the separation is going to be. And there are some changes to that can happen. We kind of help families to try to effectively deal, like when I first came in here, we had people who were tracking the amount of time that they were going to be separated with a countdown chain. And we were having a lot of families have some distress, or kids especially having some emotional regulation challenges around that, when inevitably there's some kind of a change to the deployment timeline. And there's a few weeks added, and so we're out of links on our chain, and our service members not home. So what we definitely recommend in those situations is a count up chain, so that we can kind of track what we've been going through. So that's one example of kind of a transition mediating device that we can use for a punctuated, temporary situation. Um, so I think that that's a big difference, is just the amount of time and the permanence of some of the things that these families can be reacting to. Um, there are also issues of social acceptability and impact, and willingness to seek support in those various situations. There are different stigmas that are attached to each of those areas of grief, and that's no different for military service. A lot of times with younger kids, we find that the schools, for example, are very well aware of who their military kids are in elementary schools, especially if the schools are in a military, an identified military community where there's a base nearby, and things like that. We find that the older kids get, the less they want to be identified as military kids, the less they want to be identified as a unique population, like a niche population. And I suspect that's probably really different from the way that children who are dealing with their parents being incarcerated. In the culture in the United States, those numbers are relatively similar. I think there's probably a lot more awareness of children who are dealing with military-related separations than there are who are aware of children who are dealing with incarceration and things like that, because of the stigma that might be attached to it. And I would lump foster care and divorce in with those as well. And if the emotional regulation skills are too overtaxed and things like that, even people who are dealing with grief related to death can deal with a certain amount of stigma, just in feeling like they don't have the resources or they don't have the support to be able to kind of openly express what they're dealing with. So I think those are some pretty big differences, and I think that support seeking and having trust in all of these situations is extremely important.
Thank you very much. My last question for you is, what would you like a teacher to know who might have a child or teenager in their classroom impacted by grief and loss? Sorry, here it says due to foster care placement, due to parental deployment. I'm a social worker. I know how to swerve, right? And are dealing with any that's
there
right.
too.
Dealing with any other grief I've experiences. Oh.
Great. This is a great question. So I think first and foremost, it's extremely important to know who your active duty and who your reserve families are, and really know what your resources are that are available. If we get a lot of requests for our services from folks who are away from the base, who are living out in, say, Lancaster, Palmdale, and things like that, who come out here for drill weekends, and they're 100 miles from any military installation. And the idea of being able to be connected to any kind of military educated resources is a kind of a far-fetched prospect. So it's really important for teachers and educators who are on the front lines kind of seeing how these behavior changes are actually affecting daily level of functioning. It's really important for them to be aware of what kind of resources are available. But before you can do that, you need to know who your military kids are. And honestly, in my experience, the older the kids get in a junior high and high school, the less likely it is that school counselors, principals, and teachers are even going to be aware of the unique factors that are impacting these kids' lives. It's a function of maybe the stigma, as we were talking about before. There are a lot of different reasons that could be the case, but it's really important to ask questions and check your demographics. It's also really important, if you do have that knowledge, to know which students are dealing with upcoming or current transitions. And if possible, it's really great to know what kind of work the service member actually does and what kind of deployments, what kind of duration, all of those things. If you're farther away from the community, there's actually, from the active duty community, there's a lot more diversity in the kinds of jobs that reservists might be doing in your community and things like that. And so being able to educate yourself on those things just by asking questions of the people who are impacted, I think is a really strong, a really important skill. Also, it's really important to know what military specific resources are available to support these families. Failing that, any resource is a great resource for a family. But if you are able to provide a military specific resource, that is extremely important. And those aren't just available in communities that are adjacent to a base. So I have a couple. We have Focus, which is available on a lot of military installations. Family support centers, Marine Corps Family Team Building, Fleet Family Support Center on Navy bases are great options. I'm not as versed in the Army Air Force side of those resources, but they're all available on bases. But also, there are military family life consultants or military family life counselors in various communities. But there are also some really great off-base resources. And if you're not adjacent to a military base, there are resources like Military One Source, Soldiers Project, which is in California and Illinois, Texas, New York, Pennsylvania. There's also 211 resources. Most counties have some kind of a social services hotline where you can call and actually get some really good information about that. But one resource that a lot of people don't look to, especially when they're dealing with reservists and things like that, are VA resources, like our vet centers and our county veteran service offices. Now, even if someone is active duty and is out in a community where they're not necessarily adjacent to a base, a lot of vet centers have flexibility to be able to serve families who are active duty. And if not, they are a great way of identifying resources in the local community that are trusted and vetted. So I think those are all really important things, but it's just all about educating yourself about your students, educating yourself about the military, the specific niche of military that your students represent, and the available resources. A lot of really great ways to to appraise yourself on those those resources.
I'm so excited, and I thank you so much, especially too the direct connection to the various resources. That's very helpful. So much of what you said is so important for people to know, and I thank you once again. I thank you for all the work you're doing with children, families, couples. And for those of you who are interested in our Grief 5 campaign, I encourage you to visit notenoughgood.com, where you'll find my blog post entitled It's Grief to Me, Death, Divorce, Incarceration, Deployment, and Foster Care, where you will also find more resources for working with grieving children and teens. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.